Hi there, this is Catherine with Unfolded Heart Music. Welcome back to Lyre Foundations. We are going to be finishing kind of the whole content of the book, really. We've got just the songs left, but today we're going to be just looking at lesson 2 of chapter 6, and this is focused on arrangement. If you have not watched the transposition lesson that I've recently put up, then I would encourage you to do that first, as that is a big part of arrangement and is something that would be very helpful for you. Admittedly, arrangement is a bit more difficult than transposition because it's sort of different with every song and requires a bit more experimentation and creativity. And so if you feel like you just need to sort of get into it then and to sort of practice it, then I would agree with that. This is meant to give you a few helpful hints and pointers to get you going and to give you some ideas of how to do this. So I'll start with a little bit of a summary, and then we'll go through some of the suggestions I have, and then some examples as well. Okay, let me begin by saying that transposition and arrangement, they are two different skills. However, it is likely, not all the time, but a lot of the times, for you to need to transpose the piece before arranging it. So just take note of that. Arranging a piece, again, this is the reason for it is the same as the reason for transposition. This is taking a piece that was originally written for another instrument and wanting to make it playable on the lyre. There's a couple of things that you'll need to look at to determine if that's even possible, because the lyre just has limitations, just like any instrument. And so you need to make sure that the piece is playable within those limitations. And we'll go through that. And then we have to think about, okay, how do I make this piece not just fit within the range of the lyre, but also the capacities either of my own playing or of what the lyre itself can do? And we'll give some examples of that as we go through it. I do want to make a little bit of a side note that if you haven't encountered this YouTube station, Samantha on Mars, she does a lot of arrangements, and a lot of transposition, I'm sure, is involved in that. And so if you're interested in how to do this skill particularly, she is probably a very good person. I don't know her personally, but she's probably a very good person to ask how to do this if you're struggling with a particular piece. Or if you just want to learn and be given some examples, then take a look at her channel, and it may be a really helpful place for you to understand, oh, I know that original piece, that this is how it was played and made playable on the lyre. So that's really what we're focusing on today, is how to make a song playable on the lyre. There's many different things to look at. We're going to look at some basics and give some suggestions of how to do this, because it's unique for every piece. Okay, so let's go ahead, take a look at page 83, and we'll jump into some of these suggestions. Okay, first we are looking at just suggested steps for arranging a song. This is how I would do it. I don't do a lot of arrangement because I write so much music specifically for the lyre, but a lot of people want to be able to have this skill and to make more music available to them. So here's how I have done it and how I would suggest to do it. So the first step is, first of all, just make sure that the piece can be arranged for the lyre. I mentioned this in the last video, but let me say it again here. The first thing to look for is, are there any accidentals? That is, any sharps, flats, naturals that are not in the key signature. Depends. I say that with a little bit of a caveat, because sometimes people don't actually use the key signature. It's just kind of poor use of writing sheet music, but they'll have maybe all the Fs have a sharp next to it. So if that's the case, see if there are any F naturals, for example. Okay. Assuming that there is a key signature that is correct, I would assume that for most things. See if there are any accidentals in it. If there are, for me, that's a no-go. That means I really can't play this piece. I'm looking at this especially in the melody line. So for example, it's usually a piano or a harp piece that I'm looking at. And so if it's in the left hand that's accompanying the melody, it's not as big of a deal, because it's usually just to add a little bit of flavor. It's very interesting, but it's not, it's not essential for the piece to sound like the piece. On the other hand, if the melody line does have accidentals and I leave that out or try and change it, it's going to resemble the original song, but it's going to be a bit farther from from the melody line from the original song itself, it probably will be a disappointing result for you. So I don't do that personally. Okay. The second part is if the melody line, sort of grossly exceeds the range of your lyre, then it's not possible to arrange that song on your lyre. If like on a piano piece you have a little thing going on and then it moves up a whole octave and plays sort of the same thing, you could bring it down another octave. It's going to sound different, but it won't sound wrong or incorrect. So that would be the only sort of caveat to that point. All right, number 2, just consider if you need to transpose the song to another key. And again, we already went over that in lesson 1, so take a look at that if you haven't watched it already. Okay, then number 3 is just, first of all, identify the melody line. Use this as your foundation. With most songs, which when we think about it kind of makes a lot of sense, most songs we really hear and identify by the melody line. You might hum it, you might sing it if it has words. You're not really humming the bass line or whatever the harmony is going on in that piece. That's not what you really identify as the song itself. And because of that, you have a lot more room to change that harmony line than you would the melody line. If you change the melody line too much, then it's not going to sound like the song. And again, you're going to be disappointed. So identifying what that melody line is, it's usually going to be the top note, but not always. Depends on the complexity of the piece. And so make sure that you're maintaining that line as you make other changes in the future. Okay, number 4, identify the primary harmony notes and integrate these into your other hand. And so, if it's one of the reasons you might want to be arranging a piece is because maybe it's just too complicated for the lyre, or it just doesn't sound good when you have, this really big chord, for example, played on the lyre. It sounds too muddy, for example. In that case, make a simplified version of it, but identify what is the main note in that left hand, in that bass line or that harmony line that is really complementing the melody line. And what I would do if I were you is I would play a little bit of that melody line and experiment with the harmony line, experiment with different notes to see what is it that actually is supporting in that left hand the melody line, and is it still identifiable as the song. And that's kind of something I would do throughout all of these changes, is to ask yourself, does this still sound like the original song, or have I changed it to such a degree that it's unrecognizable and it's really not that same song anymore? Just as a way to sort of check yourself. Okay. Number 5 then is basically now you have a framework of the song. You have your melody, which is what you're looking for. You have a little bit of an accompaniment. And now you can just add any other notes that you may want. You may not want that. Maybe the whole point of you arranging it is to make it more simple. Or maybe not. Maybe you're just trying to condense some of the piece and you want to add different chords or embellishments to the song. That's totally fine. Make sure, though, that whatever you add does not detract from the melody. Again, check. See, is this still recognizable or is it not? Does it sound like a completely different piece now, and is that what I want? Okay. The second part of this is just looking at helpful hints, and then we'll pause and look at a few examples. Okay, so the first one is that when you're adding additional notes, sort of the easiest thing to include is a third, fifth, or an octave. And so again, that's an interval. That's the distance between two notes. If you're not sure what that is, check out some of the earlier lessons. It is a nice way to stay with melody, but not detract from it. So say I have a G that's in the melody line, and I want to add a third. If I want this G to be my primary note that the person hears, I want it to be the topmost note. So my third would be a third lower. I'd include an E. See how you still hear the G, but it just sounds a little bit supported. Now, maybe I want to try something different. Let me try a fifth down. This would be a C. Still sounds very nice. The G is still the primary note. It's just has a little bit of a different sound to it. The third suggestion is an octave, so G to G. The G is certainly primary there. It just has a little bit more fullness to it. Now, an octave is probably the hardest one to really utilize because of the range, the limited range on the lyre, but it's a suggestion. This is also true for the left hand, and maybe even more so. It may be more applicable because maybe you have, an E and a C are your primary notes. Excuse me. But it sounds a little bit anemic. It sounds a little bit sort of simplistic to just go like that. It may sound just fine, but just as an example. And so maybe I'll just use thirds for this. Hear the difference? So just as an example and as an option for you there. Okay, number 2 is identifying sort of what makes the song too complex. One of the main reasons is that it's got too many chords. This, as a pianist, is very common in some of the more difficult piano pieces, and maybe that's why I want to change it a little bit. When this is the case, take the top note of the largest interval within that chord and keep only that note. So what do I mean by that? So for example, if I've got a C, E, G chord, and I just don't want that chord, the note I'm going to take is going to be that G. Excuse me. Right there at the top. Now, if I had... Actually, let me see that example. Yeah, okay. If I have C, E, G, let me back up. If I have C, E, G... Okay, so number 2 is identifying one of the main reasons why a piece is arranged in the first place, and that is because it's too complicated. Now, if you've got chords that are making it too complicated, that's really kind of an easy fix. So there's 2 ways to identify which note to keep. So basically what you're doing is you're taking away the chords, a chord being multiple notes being played at the same time, and you want to just pick one note because that really is what sounds good, or maybe it's just where you're at in regards to skill for the lyre. So there's 2 different ways to understand, or 2 different examples, to determine what note in that chord that you keep. So the first example I'm going to give is where we have a B, a D, and a G. And I've written this pretty well here. Where did it go? You want to find the top note of the largest interval within the chord and keep only that note. So between the B and the D is a third, but between the D and the G is a fourth. So which is bigger, a third or a fourth? Clearly the fourth. And so when that's the case, that's the original chord, but I want to just keep the G because that's the dominant note of the chord. The other 2 notes are designed in this particular chord to support the G. So if the G is what's being supported, the G is what I want to keep. If I only kept the B, it's going to sound completely different, and it's not what I'll be looking for. Okay? The other example, or second example of this, and then I'll move to a second kind of chord, but here's a second example of this same idea, is if, for example, I had a C, and then an F, and then an A. What I want to take, if I look at the distance, the intervals between them, I've got C and F, that's a distance of a fourth, and then F and A, that's a distance of a third. So which one's bigger? Well, the fourth. The top note in that is the F. So I want to keep the F. Okay. The next thing to look at is if you've got a chord where all the intervals are the same. This is going to be really your one chord. So we'll do C, E, G. Between C and E is a third, and E and G is a third, And when that's the case, instead of taking that top note, I want to take the bottom note. Take that bottom note of the C. Because that's actually what's being emphasized in this particular chord. Okay, we'll see examples of that in just a second. All right, and then the third thing to just take note of, and this is the last one, is that unless you need to transpose the piece first, do that first, and then after that, never change the key signature, and then don't change the time signature. I don't know why somebody would do this, but I just want to make it really clear, don't change that time signature. It's going to make it totally, totally different and will be very unhelpful, so make sure not to do that. Okay. All right, so let's put a little bit of this in action. We're going to come back, take a pause, and then come back and look at 3 different examples to hopefully give you a little bit of a head start on this skill. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 different examples. The first we'll go through a little bit more slowly, and then the other 2, because they're just additional ones, we'll go through a little bit more swiftly. So the first example, top of page 83, we have your original on the left and the arrangement on the right. Now there's different ways to arrange pieces. It's not like there's only one way to do it. It just sort of depends on what your goals are and certainly what instrument that you're arranging it towards. So there is some flexibility here. All right, so looking at the difference between the first and the second one, we can notice first of all that I did not change, you know what, I'll start. No, that's good. Okay, I did not change the key signature. I did not transpose the piece. The range was fine for what I actually wanted, okay? The second is that both remained in the treble clef, so I didn't change the treble clef because it was already written like that. And then I did not change most of the notes in the melody line. Now I did change a little bit, and we can see which ones I changed. So the first measure, I didn't change anything. The second measure, I changed the last 2 notes because they really exceeded the range of my lyre, and it still sounded pretty decent in regards to the comparison between the before and the after. I've kept all the rhythms the same. Usually you can do that. That's not usually the problem with it. It's mostly what actual notes you're going to be playing. I simplified, well, let me just follow my actual thing here. So things that I did need to change, the range. So especially the lower end, if we look at the left hand, we can see that, I mean, it's sort of a funny example, but we can see that there's some really, really low notes there that far exceed the range of my lyre. I didn't transpose it because I would need to have shifted everything up really high, and that would have left me not being able to get to notes at the top melody line. And remember, we want to keep that melody line as far as possible. So on that lower end, what I mostly did was I just raised them 1 octave. So if I had, you know, just take it on here. So if I've got an F down here, but maybe you've got a 16-string lyre, you can't play that F, but I could play it up here, then I played the F here. Now it's going to sound a little bit different, but it won't, the intervals and the chords won't clash with each other because you're still using the same tone or the same pitch, sort of, but you're not messing with any of the intervals, which is great. It's going to be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. Okay. And then the second thing that I changed on this, it was too complicated with the chords themselves, so I just really simplified this. Some of them I left really just at the end because that's where I'm gonna stop the piece, of course. And so if I use chords throughout, it's gonna sound a little bit muddy. So say I played through parts of this just to test it out, and I think that's too muddy, I don't really want that. Try it simplified, and then move from there and see if you want to keep any of the chords or if you just want to make them all single notes. I prefer usually to have single notes on the lyre for a number of different reasons, but anyways, okay. And if you want to take a look at what notes I kept, you can take a closer look at that as well. So let me spell this out a little bit more succinctly. If we're looking at the left hand, the first note is the same. The second note is too low, and so I raised that an octave. The third note, or the third chord, it's both a chord, which I decided I didn't want, and therefore I look at where's the biggest distance between those two notes out of those 3 notes, and I see that it is that B, so I kept the B. And then the other thing that I kind of ran into with this particular piece is that the hands ran into each other a little bit. And so that's why I had to adjust those 8th notes at the end of the first measure. And so I also didn't have that range at the bottom. And so I just kept the first note and then bumped up the next 3 notes 1 octave, and it worked just fine. Then in the last measure, I found in this first chord the top note of the largest interval, kept that note. Same thing on the second one. There's only one interval, so that's automatically the largest one, so I kept that D. And then for the last part, I went ahead and just kept this bottom note here because it sounded best with the chord that I had already at the top. Okay, next two examples, more briefly. So we have a little bit of a longer example here. The top part, number 2, top part is the original, bottom part is adjusted and changed. So the thing that I did not change, really almost everything needed to be changed on this. So this is a big difference between this. The first thing is that I changed the key signature because of range issues, and I had to transpose it from B minor to E minor. And so we can see that everything shifted down quite a large amount. I did this because I wanted the melody to be in the lyre's range, and for me it was okay that the bottom notes of the accompanying chords were dropped and were left out. The second thing I changed is that I noticed that the left hand was in bass clef, and I didn't want to do that, and so I changed that to treble clef. That's something to really take note of if you're working from another instrument. And then finally, the range and the chords, I've already mentioned this. In the left hand, I just essentially dropped that bottom note of the chord. All right, then the third example, we see the original at the top, the arrangement at the bottom. Things I did not change, I didn't change this key signature. I did not transpose it at all. I did not change the clefs. I didn't need to do that. Both are in treble clef. Things I did change was the range. The notes in the lower range were pulled down an octave to separate the hands so that I could actually play the upper range a bit lower. And then with the different chords, I took all the chords out of the right hand and made them single notes because I liked that better with this particular instrument. So I dropped the left hand down because the hands were clashing into each other too much, and just kept those single notes. Okay. And then finally, for practice, same suggestion as with the transposition. Take a piece. I would take well, it can't be too simple, otherwise it's not really going to work. But take a piece that maybe has a lot of chords to it, or has some complexity in maybe the left hand that you don't really want, and see if you can change it in different ways, whether that's the range, whether that's taking out the chords, so that you can still keep that main melody line. Got to make sure that fits in the lyre first, and then adding other things from the original, but sort of taking one piece at a time and testing it and seeing if that sounds good, if it still sounds like the original piece, and if it sounds good on the lyre. So essentially just give this a shot, try it out. Again, look at examples maybe of other ones that people have done, and that should help you out with it. All right, we're going to close for a moment and then come back with a very brief conclusion. All right, so that is the conclusion of part 2, which is huge. This is all the learning content really of the piece, of the course. And so what I was going to say is that now is part 3, where we have different pieces for beginner players. I'll say a few more notes about this when we get started on this as well. But what I'm going to essentially do, this is my plan as of now, I am going to make probably just one video where I talk a bit about each of these 5 pieces. And then I'm very soon going to make videos, probably again just one video where I play through each of these pieces. Now I call them beginner player pieces, but it does assume that you have worked through a fair bit of the course before you're here. I won't say any more because this is not that lesson, but I just really hope that this course has been helpful for you. I know it's a lot of information. Hopefully, if you've experienced it being overwhelming at all, that as you go through it, or the parts that were overwhelming, it becomes more and more clear. And I hope that it really just offers you, in a certain sense, everything that you need to be able to utilize the lyre in whatever way that you personally desire to do it. This may be the case, for example, you don't really want to do a lot of arrangement or transposition, but you want to write a lot on the lyre itself. Awesome. I hope that helps you. Maybe the opposite is true. Maybe you don't really feel comfortable composing on the lyre. You don't really want to do that. But there's some pieces that you really love, and so you want to be able to do that on the lyre, but you're not quite sure how to do that, or you can't find somebody else who has done that. Hopefully there's a couple of tools that I've offered for you here that allow you to do that and open up that space for you. And then, of course, at the beginning part 1, where we had all those exercises and just how to hold the lyre, getting used to it. Hopefully, as you work through those, your capacity to play different things has really improved. So anyways, I just hope it's a gift to you. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help as I'm able. And I hope that your journey with the lyre is just going beautifully, and I hope it's a joy for you. All right. Thank you so much. May God bless you, and the peace of Christ be with you. Thanks again.